A train approaches a junction in fog. The engineer leans forward, watching the line ahead. He cannot see beyond 200 feet. He does not know if the track is clear. He waits for a signal. Someone standing beside the rails raises a lamp. The train moves forward. It passes through without incident. This happened thousands of times each day for decades because men stood where trains could see them. Railways divided distance into sections. A train entering one section had to know whether another train occupied the space ahead. There was no way for the engineer to see this from the cab. Curves, embankments, and weather reduced visibility to fragments. The only reliable method was to place a person at fixed intervals along the line, each responsible for a short stretch of track. These positions were called signal points. A signalman stood at each one, watching trains enter and leave his section. When a train passed, he communicated its position to the next signal point, then set his equipment to either permit or block the following train. Trains did not proceed on schedules alone. They proceeded on indication. The indication came from a human being operating a piece of visible equipment. Without that indication, the train stopped. This was not a backup system. It was the primary system. Railways grew longer and traffic increased, but the principle remained. A train moved when a signalman said it could move. He said this by operating a mechanical device that the engineer could see from a distance. The device had to be simple, visible in poor light, and readable at speed. It had to function in rain, snow, and darkness. It could not rely on anything the train carried. Everything necessary to control the train had to already be standing beside the track. The signalman did not manage the railway. He managed a small section of it, but every section had someone. That distribution of responsibility made the system work. One man could not see the entire line. 50 men, spaced along it, could. The equipment varied depending on the railway and the period, but the function did not. A signal arm was a flat blade mounted on a post, painted to contrast with the sky. When lowered, it blocked part of the engineer's view. This meant stop. When raised, it cleared the sightline. This meant proceed. The arm was operated by a lever inside a small wooden structure called a signal box. The lever connected to the arm through a system of rods and cables. Pulling the lever required physical effort. The signalman pulled it when the section ahead was confirmed clear. He returned it when the section was occupied or when uncertainty existed. At night or in fog, the arm was not visible. A lamp hung on the same post, colored red or green depending on the position of the arm. The lamp used oil or later kerosene. The signalman inspected and refilled it during his shift. If the lamp failed, he stood beside the track with a hand lantern and flagged the train manually. Red meant stop. Green or white meant proceed. These were not suggestions. They were commands. A train ignoring a signal risked collision. The engineer trusted that the signal reflected real conditions farther down the line. The signalman was responsible for making that trust accurate. He did not see the trains miles away. He received information from adjacent signal points, usually by telegraph or bell code. When a train passed his position heading east, he rang the next box to the east. That signalman then set his signal to stop until the train cleared his section. Then he rang the box beyond him. The sequence repeated. Each signalman operated the same equipment, followed the same protocol, and worked alone. A shift could last 8 to 12 hours. Most of that time was spent watching. When a train came, the signalman moved quickly. He confirmed position, operated levers, lit lamps if necessary, and watched the train pass. Then he waited again. A signalman was responsible for the safety of trains he could not see and passengers he would never meet. His task required no advanced skill, but it required absolute consistency. A mistake could occur in a single moment of distraction. Setting a signal to proceed while the track ahead remained occupied would allow 2 trains to enter the same section. The result was often catastrophic. The signalman had no way to verify track conditions beyond what other signalmen reported to him. He operated on information passed along a chain. If someone earlier in the chain made an error, the signalman might set his signal incorrectly without knowing. The system depended on every participant performing correctly every time. There was no margin for approximation. A signalman did not make decisions about train priority or routing. Those decisions came from higher authority. His role was execution. He received an order, confirmed it, and set the signal. He did not interpret. He did not adjust based on weather or intuition. He followed procedure. The isolation of the role was notable. Most signal boxes stood alone, often miles from the nearest town. A signalman worked without supervision. No one watched him pull the levers. No one confirmed that he checked the lamps. His only interaction was with the brief passage of trains and the intermittent signals from adjacent boxes. He was trusted because the system required trust. There was no alternative. Responsibility was individual, but the consequences of failure extended across the network. A single incorrect signal could delay dozens of trains or cause a wreck that closed the line for days. The signalman knew this. It shaped how he worked. He did not rush. He confirmed each step. He kept his equipment in order. He stayed awake during night shifts. The work was not dramatic. It was repetitive and procedural, but it was not careless. As rail traffic increased, the limitations of manual signaling became evident. More trains required more signal points. Each new signal point required another signalman, another structure, and another segment of track that depended on human attention. The cost and complexity grew in proportion to the traffic. Coordination between signal boxes became more difficult. A delay at one point affected every point downstream. Signalmen communicated by telegraph or bell, but these methods were slow and prone to misunderstanding. A missed signal or a misread code could create confusion across several sections. The system worked, but it required constant vigilance from many people simultaneously. Errors were infrequent but not impossible. When they occurred, the results were often severe. Railways began to examine whether the system could be made more reliable or more efficient. The fundamental problem was that each signalman operated independently with limited information. He could see only his section. He could control only his signals. He could not know the position of every train on the line. Centralized control would require gathering information from all signal points into one location and allowing a single operator to manage a longer stretch of track. But this required technology that did not yet exist in a practical form. For decades, the manual system remained because no alternative was feasible. Signalmen continued to work alone in their boxes, operating levers and watching trains pass. The volume of traffic increased, and the system adapted by adding more signal points and more men. This worked, but it did not scale indefinitely. Railways understood that the system would eventually need to change. The question was not whether manual signaling would be replaced, but when. Centralized signaling systems began to appear in the early 20th century. These systems allowed one operator in a control tower to manage signals across several miles of track. Information about train positions was transmitted electrically to a central panel. The operator could see the location of every train within his area and set signals accordingly. This reduced the number of people required and eliminated much of the communication delay between signal points. The transition was gradual. New systems were installed first on high-traffic lines where the investment could be justified. Older lines continued to operate with manual signals. For a period, both systems coexisted. A train might pass through a section controlled by a central tower, then enter a section where a signalman still stood beside the track with a lever and a lamp. The signalmen were not dismissed immediately. Many continued working as the new systems were tested and expanded. Some were retrained to operate equipment in the control towers. Others remained at their posts until their sections were converted. The work did not change for them. They still pulled levers and confirmed train positions, but the number of active signal boxes decreased steadily. Automation also began to appear, though more slowly. Automatic block signals used electrical circuits in the rails to detect the presence of a train. When a train entered a block, the signal behind it automatically turned red. When the train exited, the signal returned to green. No human action was required. These systems were reliable and did not require constant attention. Railways adopted them where feasible, particularly on long stretches of straight track with predictable traffic. The role of the signalman narrowed. He was no longer essential on every section. He was still necessary in some locations, particularly at complex junctions or on branch lines where traffic was too light to justify the cost of automation. But the total number of signalmen declined. Signal boxes were closed quietly. A section would be converted to automatic or centralized control and the box would be locked. The levers remained inside. The lamps stayed on the posts, though they were no longer lit. Trains continued to pass. The difference was that no one stood beside the track to watch them. Some boxes were demolished. Others were left standing, weathering in place. A few were repurposed for storage or sold. Many simply decayed. The signalman as a distinct occupation faded over the span of several decades. By the middle of the 20th century, most railways had eliminated the majority of manual signal positions. A few remained on rural or industrial lines, but they were exceptions. The work that had once required thousands of men was now handled by machines and centralized operators. There was no ceremony marking the change. Signalmen retired or moved to other work. The railways continued to operate. Trains still required signals, but the signals no longer required men standing alone in small wooden structures. The skill became obsolete not because it was performed poorly, but because it was no longer necessary. The tracks remain. The routes are the same. Trains still stop and proceed based on signals. The signals still communicate whether a section is clear or occupied. But the information comes from circuits and computers, not from a man pulling a lever in a box beside the rails. The system works. It works because the principle endures. A train does not move unless it is told it can move. The method of communication changed. The need for communication did not. The signalman is gone. The trains continue to pass.